So, when you are processing a landscape, there is one thing you should be thinking of throughout your entire workflow, and that is how to control, not enhance, but control depth, or as I like to call it, perceived depth, because photography is it's a two-dimensional medium. So it's up to us to use our skill and talent to manipulate that depth into something that is visually pleasing. The perceived depth in a photograph, it's what draws a viewer in. It's what makes our images visually interesting. It tells that visual story which sets our images apart from the masses. So it's the most basic yet important building block to our images. Now, there are many tactical tools and techniques that we can use. Choosing the best color profile, making our colors more rich and vibrant, the masking panel, making stronger local adjustments with that. So many different tools at our fingertips, but it all comes down to controlling that depth. So, in the next few minutes, I'm going to quickly go over 4 relationships in a landscape photograph that control depth. And it all comes down to contrast. Now, before we get started, you should know that the 4 methods I'm about to show you, it's all outlined in a free PDF guide that I've created. I call it a Lightroom workflow cheat sheet, and I'll put a link to that above this video where you can go and download your copy completely free. And it's basically a bird's eye view of my entire Lightroom workflow. I go over importing, organizing, processing, and exporting, as well as the 4 ways I control depth. And since this video will be very fast paced in order to get the point across very quickly, I do recommend downloading that cheat sheet because there are a few nuances that I'll be skipping over here which are addressed more fully in that PDF. All right, let's jump over to the desktop here and I'll show you the first way that I control depth with contrast. Okay, so when I say contrast, I don't mean taking the contrast slider here and pumping it up to enhance that visual interest. That is only one definition of contrast. The actual term contrast, as it pertains to photography, simply means how 2 areas relate to one another. The differences between them, what that amount is. So how they contrast with one another. So for example, let's zoom in here really close. We are comparing these very white, bright pixels in the snow to the very dark, almost black pixels in the shadows here. That contrast is pretty high. It's pretty strong. The distance between those 2 pixels on the value scale. However, if we're looking at the medium gray pixels in the tree branch here compared to the medium gray pixels of the cabin, that contrast is very low. The difference of value between those 2 pixels, it's very small. So these 2 areas, they kind of blend together and aren't nearly as interesting or strong. So the point is that the contrast can be either high or low. It can be strong or weak. We're just talking about the quality or the amount in between those 2 points. So let's zoom back out and take a look at the first type of contrast that enhances depth, and that is the contrast of lightness. So when looking at these 2 images here, and it's an image I love to use in my lessons because there's so many processing principles and elements that are represented here. So first we have the original raw file on the left and then the processed version on the right. Now this was taken with a very long focal length which flattens your depth. It reduces the distance between your focal points. So in the original raw file here, which is pretty underexposed, I should have exposed more for the highlights here, but we have the cabin here in the foreground, then we have the road going up, and then the trees in the background. The distances between those 3 points was really great, but it's not represented here because of that long focal length. But when we look at the final process image here on the right, the cabin in the foreground really pops from the background. It stands out. And that is because one of the things I did to this image was make the cabin brighter. I increased the exposure of the snow on the roof here, and then also this little area in the foreground. Then I also darkened this tree in the background, and then in the bottom right corner, I added some more shadow to it. So I increased the contrast of lightness, which made it become more 3-dimensional and pop from the background. And that is because brighter areas appear closer to the viewer than darker areas. So by both brightening the subject and darkening the surrounding detail, you are widening that tonal range gap. You are increasing contrast. And that can add so much depth to an otherwise flat image. And that's one of the funny things about changing your depth here in Lightroom is that many photographers assume that when it comes to depth and perspective in landscapes, that it's static. That it is what it is and you can't change it once you capture that frame. But there are so many things you can do here with depth in the darkroom. It's really incredible how you can change the flow and balance of your landscape by making very subtle shifts like this. I mean, we're not going crazy here or creating an unnatural image. We're just selectively dodging and burning and making a world of difference. And that brings me to my next type of contrast that you can use to control depth, and that is texture contrast. So, building on the lightness contrast we just went over, texture contrast simply means how much detail your subject has, or your focal point, how sharp it is, and how much local contrast is going on within that focal point. So let me show you what I mean by local contrast. Let's zoom into this cabin really close here. Local contrast is the value difference between very small areas within a subject or focal point. So the bright snow compared to the medium gray boards of the cabin to the very deep dark shadows of the knots in the wood, or the dark shadows in the vent here. The value between those pixels jump around a lot. So when we zoom out, that translates to sharp and interesting texture. So areas of high texture or high local contrast appear closer to the viewer than lower texture areas, which enhances the perceived depth. So if I add a mask here to this cabin in order to soften out the texture, let's do some before and after. Not only is the image now less visually interesting, but that cabin doesn't jump out as it once did when it was sharper with higher texture. That depth is just instantly flattened out, and it's not an interesting image anymore, or at least not as interesting. That is a basic building block as to why shallow depths of field create so much perceived depth. So for example, if we jump over to this image here, our sharpest focal point in the image is the leaf and the stone wall in the foreground. That's where the slice of focus is. And the background is now rendered very blurry. This creates texture contrast between your point of focus, the subject, and the background. So although there's so much going on with the background, with the big trees and the color and the light coming through the leaves, that is now taking a backstage to the intense texture and interest in the foreground. So this texture contrast gives the appearance of a much deeper image, since the subject is now separated from the very busy background environment. It's jumping out at you. All right, so far we've only discussed how the lightness value can change the perceived depth of our image. Now what about hue or color contrast? That also affects our perception of depth on a two-dimensional photograph. So let's jump over to a different image here. And here we have a very colorful image with a very flat perceived depth. The depth is flat as a pancake because I'm photographing this leaf as it lays on the ground. So nothing in the field here is helping to increase depth. So in order to make this leaf stand out from the hot top without blurring that texture, because if we did that, that would look very unnatural and odd, I used hue or color to make that happen. So very basically, if your subject has a very strong color, like this vibrant gold leaf here, it will appear more three-dimensional when it's surrounded by a particular hue. In this case, it's the purpley blue of the hot top. Now, there's a lot that goes into color contrast and color theory when it comes to depth perception. It's way too much to get into here, but the point is that when two complementary colors, so colors that are opposite of one another on the color wheel, when they interact with one another, so the orange leaf against the bluish purple hot top, that background hue amplifies that leaf even more, which creates separation from the ground. It makes it appear more three-dimensional. Actually, if we jump over to Photoshop for a second, I want to show you something. Okay, so on the left is the color of the leaf and the hot top. Two complementary hues against each other. And to the right is the same hue of the leaf, but surrounded by an analogous color, which is a color next to it on the color wheel rather than across. So which box stands out more here? Which one has the better color separation? Obviously, it's the one on the left. It almost looks like there's a shadow around it. So the hue contrast here, where the orange is amplified by that blue, that is what enhances the depth perception. And also, this is very important as well, warmer hues will appear closer to the viewer than cooler hues. So your reds, your yellows, your oranges, those are going to jump out to the viewer, especially when they're supported or surrounded by cooler blues and purples. So if I make a quick change here and compare the process hues on the left, the orange leaf and the bluish purple hot top, to the two colors on the right, which is the leaf compared to the original hue and saturation of the hot top. It was a very muted grayish blue, a neutral color temperature almost. But by amplifying the saturation and cooling down that hue even more, see how much more that orange stands out now? The color contrast is so strong here because all it takes is a very small bump in saturation or a slight shift in the hue to completely change the depth perception of your landscape. Now, if you download that Lightroom cheat sheet that I mentioned earlier, there's a link in there for a free processing course. And in that, I have a very in-depth lesson called Luminosity of Color. And that is where I dive deep into the relationship of hue and lightness and how that affects depth perception. And I also have a lesson on how texture and lightness affect depth. So what we just went over, I dive deeper into that. So if you'd like to learn more about controlling depth in landscape photography, make sure to click the link above this video and download that cheat sheet, and those lessons will come with it. All right, on to our fourth type of contrast in landscape photography, and that is the contrast of scale, meaning the size of one focal point or layer in your landscape. Actually, let's switch over to the example image here. So we're talking about the size of one focal point, for example, this tree in the foreground here, compared to other focal points or layers. So we can see that this tree here is much bigger than these pine trees way in the background. So they start bigger here and then they recede to a very small size near the mountain range. So by comparing the scale of those trees, we can interpret this as having a very good deal of distance between them. So this goes back to a very basic art principle when dealing with a two-dimensional medium like photography, and that is the scale of your elements. So when we are looking at this image on the left, compared side by side with a copy that I adjusted for scale, I made the mountain range much larger as well as the tree line here on the right. Now over here in the original image, the perceived distance between the foreground tree here and the tree line on the right, it's pretty great. There's a big size difference. And then of course the distance between those trees and the very small mountains in the background is quite great as well. So a lot of depth here. But when the perspective is altered by enlarging both the trees and the mountains over here on the right, and this isn't a good edit by the way, I just quickly threw this together to illustrate my point. It's a very sloppy composite. But when these focal points are bigger, the rendered depth is condensed. The background elements appear much closer than they were before because of that reference of scale. These trees are now pretty close in size to those trees, and the mountains appear much closer because they are so much bigger. Now, here's the interesting part, and it's a big point I want to make here when it comes to scale and depth. Your perspective. Sometimes you want to close that gap. Contrary to what many people think, you don't always want to increase the amount of depth in a photograph, especially when it comes to landscapes. So although the depth has been flattened here in the right image, to me, this photo now looks more compelling than the original. I like having that large imposing mountain range and the taller trees, as opposed to just an empty sky. It feels more dramatic, like I've been dropped right into the middle of a valley here. So if I were to take this photograph again, I would have used a longer lens in order to capture a couple frames where these layers were larger, the tree line on the right and then the mountains in the background, and then blend those exposures together in Photoshop to get what you now see here, just at a much higher quality. So that is why I never say it's about increasing depth, but rather controlling depth. It's purposeful depth perception. And the same thing goes for your other contrast types we've gone over. Perhaps you want to reduce the texture contrast or lightness contrast or color contrast in order to make a focal point stand out less and create a better balanced frame. That's what we're going for here, to tell a clearer visual story and lead the eyes through your frame in a way that just makes sense. And as a final note before I wrap this video up, these four qualities of depth, lightness, texture, color, and scale, they are not mutually exclusive. You'll be manipulating at least two of these qualities in every photograph you process in order to either enhance or minimize your depth. For example, let's take a look at another image here. In this image, we have a few things going on here that greatly enhances the perceived depth of an otherwise flat location. If you were actually here taking this photograph, the distance between the leaves in the foreground and the end of the driveway in the background was probably only about 50 feet, but it feels much deeper than that. And that is because we first have perspective depth created by the camera. The wide focal length made the background seem much smaller and the leaves in the foreground much larger than they actually were. And then we also have lightness contrast, where the very bright leaves surrounded by the very dark hot top really pushes those leaves forward. And we also have a bit of texture contrast as well, with the very detailed, sharp leaves against the otherwise smooth and flat background. But the most apparent contrast here that enhances depth is the color contrast. The very saturated, warm colors contrasting strongly against the cool hue of the hot top. So that really makes those leaves jump out. And not to mention, they are pretty close to being complementary colors as well. So we have that hue contrast going on, as well as the color temperature. So several very strong qualities here that enhance the perceived depth greatly. Now, you can manipulate the actual perspective here in Lightroom, the actual size of your focal points. You can only change the perceived perspective through color and lightness adjustments. The only way to actually control your perspective, the size of it, it's in two steps. One is how that image is actually rendered in the field with your camera, and that depends on your vantage point, how close you place the camera to that foreground interest, and the distance between the foreground and the middle ground, and then the middle ground and the background, which is determined by your chosen focal length. So that's step one. And step two is manipulating your perspective over in Photoshop with exposure blending. Now, there are a lot of different terms for this. Some people call it perspective blending, focal blending, etc., but they all fall under the exposure blending umbrella term, which simply means the selective blending of two or more different frames, different exposures. So you would take one frame in the field at a certain focal length, and then another exposure at a different focal length, and then blend those two images together. Now, if you download that Lightroom cheat sheet that I mentioned earlier, I do have a link in there to a free Photoshop course that contains a few lessons on how to accomplish this with layers of mask in Photoshop. It's really simple, and the results are incredible. So make sure to download that cheat sheet if you'd like to learn more on how to enhance that perspective contrast and create a well-balanced image. All right, I hope you found these tips helpful. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you in the next video.